The courtroom fell silent as the clock struck 9. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of concerned parents, curious onlookers, and nervous teenagers waiting for their turn before Judge Wilson. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across worried faces. This was juvenile court, where second chances were possible but never guaranteed. Among those waiting was 16-year-old Andre. He sat alone in the third row, his shoulders hunched forward in a gray button-up shirt that his grandmother had ironed the night before. The collar felt too tight, but she had insisted he look respectable. His hands wouldn't stop fidgeting, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the room's chill. Andre wasn't supposed to be here. 6 months ago, he was an honor roll student with dreams of becoming an engineer. His math teacher had even written him a recommendation for a prestigious summer program. But one mistake had changed everything. The mistake wasn't that he'd been in the corner store when his friends decided to steal. The mistake wasn't even that he'd frozen in panic while they grabbed candy bars and energy drinks. His mistake was running when they ran, making him look just as guilty. The security camera footage showed it all, Andre standing by the magazine rack, his friends pocketing items, the moment of realization on his face, and then all of them bolting through the door when the owner shouted. The others had gotten away. Andre had tripped on the curb. Docket number 47923, Andre versus the state, called the clerk, a thin woman with glasses that kept sliding down her nose. Andre stood on legs that felt like water and made his way to the defendant's table. His court-appointed attorney, Mr. Rivera, patted the chair beside him. "Remember what we discussed," Mr. Rivera whispered. "Let me do the talking. The evidence isn't strong, but Judge Wilson is known to be tough on group incidents like this." Andre nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Judge Wilson entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. He was a tall man with silver hair and deep lines around his mouth that made him look like he was perpetually frowning. 20 years on the bench had given him a reputation for fairness but also firmness. Teenagers feared him, parents respected him. "Be seated," he said, his voice bouncing off the walls. The prosecutor, a young woman with a sharp blazer and sharper eyes, presented the state's case. She showed the security footage, pointed out Andre's presence, and emphasized his choice to flee the scene, consciousness of guilt, Your Honor. Mr. Rivera countered with Andre's clean record, his academic achievements, and character statements from his teachers. He explained that Andre had not taken anything, had not planned anything, and had simply made the poor decision to run out of fear and confusion. Through it all, Andre sat still, occasionally glancing at the empty chairs behind him where he wished his grandmother could be. But she couldn't miss another shift at the hospital where she worked as a custodian. "The bills don't pay themselves," she had said that morning, kissing his forehead. "Just tell the truth, baby. That's all you can do." Judge Wilson reviewed the paperwork, his expression unreadable. He looked at Andre over his reading glasses. "Young man, I see here you have no prior offenses. Your grades are impressive. But I'm troubled by your choice of friends and your decision to flee rather than stay and explain yourself. It suggests a lack of judgment that concerns me." Andre felt his chest tighten. This was it. He was going to have a record. No summer program. Maybe no engineering school. "Do you have anything to say before I make my ruling?" Judge Wilson asked. Mr. Rivera nudged Andre to stand. "Your Honor," Andre began, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Your Honor, I know I made a mistake by running. I was scared. I've never been in trouble before, and when everything happened so fast, I followed without thinking." Andre paused, feeling the weight of the judge's gaze. He had rehearsed what to say with Mr. Rivera, but now those practiced words felt hollow. "I understand if you need to punish me," Andre continued, finding his own voice now. "But I want you to know that I've learned from this. I've learned to think for myself, to stand up for what's right, even if I'm standing alone." Judge Wilson's expression softened slightly. "And what about these friends of yours? Will you be spending more time with them in the future?" The question hung in the air. Andre knew what the judge wanted to hear, a promise to cut ties, to find better influences. It would be the easy answer, the one that might earn him leniency. But as he stood there, Andre thought about his friends, not just what they'd done, but who they were. Tommy, whose mother was battling cancer and who sometimes acted out because he was hurting. Deshawn, who was brilliant at science but whose family moved so often that he never felt settled enough to focus on school. Andre didn't want to throw them under the bus. "They made bad choices that day, Your Honor, and so did I," Andre said carefully. "But they're not bad people. We all have room to grow. I can promise you that I've learned my lesson about thinking before acting, and I believe they can learn too." Judge Wilson leaned back in his chair, studying Andre with newfound interest. This wasn't the rehearsed response he was accustomed to hearing. "You show unusual loyalty, young man. Some might call it misplaced." "I call it the truth, sir," Andre replied. "And my grandmother always says there's nothing more important than being truthful, even when it's hard." The corner of Judge Wilson's mouth twitched, almost a smile. He turned to the prosecutor. "Ms. Patel, what would the state recommend in this case?" Ms. Patel stood. Given the defendant's clean record, the state would be satisfied with 6 months probation, 40 hours of community service, and mandatory check-ins with a youth counselor. Judge Wilson nodded and turned back to Andre. "And you, young man? Do you believe that would be a fair outcome?" Andre swallowed hard. The question surprised him. Judges didn't usually ask defendants if they thought the punishment was fair. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I think it's fair. And if possible, I'd like to do my community service at the engineering summer camp for elementary kids at the community center. I was going to volunteer there anyway before all this happened." Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're asking to serve your community by teaching younger children?" "Yes, sir. If that's allowed." The judge studied Andre for a long moment, then looked down at the papers before him. The courtroom remained silent, the tension almost unbearable as everyone waited for his decision. Finally, Judge Wilson cleared his throat and looked directly at Andre. He seemed about to speak when suddenly, Andre straightened his shoulders and said 2 words that changed everything. "I'm responsible." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Not "I'm sorry" or "forgive me," phrases the judge had heard countless times before. But "I'm responsible," an acknowledgement that went beyond mere apology. Judge Wilson's gaze intensified. In 20 years on the bench, he'd developed an ear for sincerity. He'd heard rehearsed remorse and coached contrition from hundreds of young people standing exactly where Andre stood now. This was different. "Would you care to elaborate on that, young man?" the judge asked, removing his reading glasses. Andre took a deep breath. "What I mean, Your Honor, is that I'm not just sorry for running. I'm responsible for my choices. I could have spoken up when I saw what my friends were doing. I could have stayed to explain to the store owner. I could have made different decisions at every step." The judge nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And I'm also responsible for what happens next," Andre continued, his voice growing steadier. "If you give me this chance, I'll be responsible with it. I won't waste it." Mr. Rivera glanced at his client with barely concealed surprise. They had prepared answers for likely questions, practiced appropriate responses, but this raw honesty wasn't part of the script. Judge Wilson tapped his pen against the bench, a habit he'd developed over years of deliberation. The courtroom remained silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional shuffle of papers. "The court appreciates your candor," he finally said. "It's refreshing to hear a young person speak of responsibility rather than circumstance." He turned to the prosecutor. Ms. Patel, given what we've heard today, does the state wish to reconsider its recommendation? Ms. Patel hesitated, then stood. The state's position remains the same, Your Honor. However, we would not object if the court saw fit to reduce the community service hours in light of the defendant's attitude. Judge Wilson nodded and returned his attention to Andre. Here's my ruling. 3 months probation, not 6. 20 hours of community service, which you may fulfill at the engineering camp as you requested, provided the program accepts you despite this incident. Andre's shoulders relaxed slightly, but Judge Wilson wasn't finished. However, the judge continued, I want you to write me a detailed plan explaining how you intend to make better choices in the future when faced with peer pressure. This plan should include specific strategies and the names of adults you can turn to for guidance. I want it on my desk in 2 weeks. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Andre replied, his voice steady. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Judge Wilson said, though his tone had softened. This is an opportunity, not a gift. What you make of it is entirely up to you. As Andre left the courtroom with Mr. Rivera, he felt lighter somehow, despite the weight of the judge's assignment. Outside in the hallway, Mr. Rivera shook his hand. That was unexpected, the attorney said. But effective. Those 2 words, I'm responsible, they changed the entire direction of your case. Andre nodded. It wasn't strategy. It's just how I feel. Even better, Mr. Rivera replied with a smile. The truth usually is. Andre took the bus home, his mind already working on the plan the judge had requested. As he walked the 3 blocks from the bus stop to his grandmother's small house, he rehearsed how he would explain everything to her. He found her in the kitchen, still in her work uniform, putting together a sandwich. When she saw him, she set everything down and opened her arms. Well? She asked as they embraced. 3 months probation. 20 hours of community service at the engineering camp. His grandmother pulled back to look at his face. That's better than we hoped for. What happened in there? Andre sat at the kitchen table and told her everything, including the 2 words that had seemed to change the judge's mind. When he finished, she nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You know where you get that from, don't you? Andre shook his head. Your mother, she said softly. She always took responsibility, even when it wasn't easy. She'd be proud of you today. Andre rarely spoke of his mother, who had died when he was 7. But in that moment, he felt connected to her memory in a new way. I need to write a plan for the judge, he said. About making better choices. His grandmother squeezed his hand. We'll work on it together. But first, you eat something. Can't plan on an empty stomach. As Andre helped himself to a sandwich, he realized that today wasn't the end of something, but the beginning. Those 2 words, I'm responsible, weren't just what the judge needed to hear. They were what Andre needed to say. The next morning, Andre woke up early. The weight of yesterday's court appearance had been replaced by a new sense of purpose. He pulled out a notebook and began drafting ideas for the plan Judge Wilson had requested. His grandmother peeked into his room on her way to work. Already at it, I see. Andre nodded. I want to get it right. Just be honest, she said, adjusting her uniform. That's what worked yesterday, isn't it? After she left, Andre continued writing. He outlined situations where he might face pressure from friends, strategies for removing himself from bad situations, and adults he trusted for guidance, his grandmother, Mr. Washington from the community center, and Ms. Chen, his math teacher. Later that afternoon, Andre walked to the community center to inquire about the engineering camp. The director, Mr. Washington, was a tall man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude who had run the center for 15 years. I heard what happened, Mr. Washington said when Andre explained his situation. News travels fast in this neighborhood. Andre looked down at his shoes. Does that mean I can't volunteer? Mr. Washington leaned back in his chair. Tell me something. Why did you ask the judge to let you serve your hours here specifically? Because I still want to teach the kids, Andre replied honestly. I'm good at explaining math and science. I can help them get excited about engineering, even with everything that happened. Mr. Washington studied him for a long moment. Most kids in your position would look for the easiest way to complete their hours. Filing papers. Cleaning up. Not teaching. I'm not trying to get off easy, Andre said. I messed up, but that doesn't change what I'm good at or what I care about. Mr. Washington nodded slowly. The camp starts in 3 weeks. We'll need to do a special interview with the board given your situation. And you'll need to come up with lesson plans that impress them. I can do that, Andre said quickly. I believe you can, Mr. Washington replied. But there's something else I want you to do first. What's that? Go talk to Mr. Chen at the corner store. The one you ran from. Andre felt his stomach tighten. You want me to apologize to him? I want you to face it, Mr. Washington said firmly. You told the judge you're responsible. Prove it. That evening, Andre stood outside the corner store, his heart pounding. Through the window, he could see Mr. Chen behind the counter, helping a customer. The same counter he'd run from 6 months ago. Andre took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The familiar bell jingled overhead. Mr. Chen looked up, his expression changing as recognition dawned. I know you, he said after the customer left. You're one of the boys who ran. Andre swallowed hard. Yes, sir. I am. And I came to apologize in person. Mr. Chen crossed his arms. You didn't take anything. It wasn't a question, but Andre answered anyway. No, sir. But I ran. And I'm sorry for that. The two stood in silence for a moment, the only sound coming from the humming refrigerators along the wall. Why come back now? Mr. Chen finally asked. Andre straightened his shoulders. Because I'm trying to be responsible for my actions. And I couldn't do that without facing you. Mr. Chen's expression softened slightly. He gestured toward a stool behind the counter. Sit, he said. I close in 20 minutes. We can talk then. Andre nodded and sat quietly, watching as Mr. Chen assisted the few customers who came in. He noticed how the store owner greeted some by name, asked about family members, and even set aside specific items for regular customers. This wasn't just a business to Mr. Chen, it was a community. When the last customer left, Mr. Chen flipped the sign to "closed" and locked the door. I came to this country with nothing, Mr. Chen said as he began straightening products on the shelves. My wife and I worked 14 hours a day for 10 years to save enough to open this store. When people steal, they don't just take things. They take from our dream. Andre listened, the knot in his stomach growing tighter. I'm truly sorry, he said. I didn't steal anything that day, but I was there. I should have said something when I saw what was happening. Mr. Chen nodded. The other boys, they were caught eventually? No, sir, Andre admitted. Just me. Because I fell. Mr. Chen made a sound between a sigh and a laugh. Life has a way of making us fall when we need to learn something. He gestured around the store. You see mess anywhere? Andre looked around. The store was spotless, every item perfectly aligned. No, sir. I clean everything myself. Every night. No one helps me. Andre understood what wasn't being said. I could help. After school. If you'd let me. Mr. Chen raised an eyebrow. You offering because you feel guilty? Partly, Andre admitted. But also because I need to make things right. Not just say I'm sorry, but show it. Mr. Chen studied him for a long moment. 3 days a week. 4 to 6. I don't pay you, but I will write letter for your judge saying you are making amends. Thank you, Mr. Chen, Andre said, relief washing over him. I won't let you down. We will see, Mr. Chen replied, but there was no anger in his voice. The following Monday, Andre started his new routine. School until 3:15, then straight to the corner store to help Mr. Chen. The work was simple but exhausting, mopping floors, restocking shelves, taking inventory, but Andre never complained. On his third day, while arranging cans on a shelf, Andre noticed a group of boys enter the store. His heart dropped when he recognized Tommy and Deshawn among them. His friends from that day. They didn't notice him at first, busy laughing and grabbing snacks. Then Deshawn turned and stopped mid-sentence when he spotted Andre in the store apron. Yo, what are you doing here? He asked, confusion clear on his face. Before Andre could answer, Mr. Chen emerged from the back room. The atmosphere instantly tensed. Tommy nudged Deshawn. Let's bounce. Andre stood frozen, caught between his old friends and Mr. Chen. This was the moment he'd been dreading, and the exact situation he'd written about in his plan for Judge Wilson. Now he had to decide, would he follow his friends again, or stand his ground? Andre straightened his shoulders and stepped forward. I work here now, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Part of my community service. Tommy snickered. Community service? Man, they got you working for free? It's not like that, Andre replied. I'm making things right. Deshawn looked between Andre and Mr. Chen, realization dawning on his face. This is the store. From that day? Andre nodded. You snitched on us? Tommy asked, his voice hardening. No, Andre said firmly. I didn't give them your names. But I did take responsibility for my part. Mr. Chen stepped closer to Andre. You boys buying something or just looking? Tommy grabbed a candy bar and tossed some money on the counter. Keep the change, he muttered, giving Andre a look that clearly said their friendship was over. Deshawn lingered as the others left. For real, you working here now? 3 days a week, Andre confirmed. It was my choice. Deshawn nodded slowly. My dad lost his job again. That's why you know. He gestured vaguely around the store. Andre hadn't known. Deshawn never talked about his home life. Mr. Chen needs help with inventory on Thursdays, Andre said quietly. I could ask if he needs another person. You do that? After what happened? We all mess up, Andre said. It's what we do after that matters. When Deshawn left, Mr. Chen approached Andre. Your friends? They were, Andre said. I'm not sure anymore. Mr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. The tall one with the sad eyes. He has troubles at home? Andre was surprised by Mr. Chen's perception. His dad lost his job. They move around a lot. Was all Mr. Chen said before returning to work. The following day, Andre received a text from Deshawn. Mr. C called my mom. Said he needs weekend help. Pays $10 per hour. You do this? Andre smiled. He hadn't mentioned anything to Mr. Chen after their conversation, but somehow the store owner had understood. That afternoon, Andre worked on his plan for Judge Wilson with renewed purpose. He wrote about his conversation with Mr. Chen, his encounter with his friends, and the lessons he was learning about responsibility extending beyond himself. When Friday came, Andre submitted his completed plan to the courthouse. The clerk promised to deliver it to Judge Wilson and gave Andre a court date for the following month to review his progress. As Andre left the courthouse, he felt different than he had during his first visit. The building seemed less imposing somehow, as if by facing his mistakes head-on, he had diminished their power over him. His phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Washington, "Board meeting about the engineering camp tomorrow. 10 a.m. Bring your lesson plans." Andrei took a deep breath. Another challenge, another opportunity to prove himself. The words he had spoken in court, "I'm responsible," had become more than just a statement. They had become a way of life. The community center buzzed with activity as Andrei arrived for his meeting with the board. Children played basketball in the gym while parents chatted near the entrance. This place had been a second home to Andrei since he was 10 years old, and the thought of being rejected by the board made his stomach churn. He clutched his folder of lesson plans, which he'd stayed up late perfecting. Simple engineering projects using household items, paper bridges, egg drop protectors, homemade speakers. Activities that would engage the younger kids while teaching basic concepts. Mr. Washington met him at the door to the conference room. "Ready?" Andrei nodded, trying to appear more confident than he felt. Inside, 5 board members sat around a table. Andrei recognized a few: Mrs. Taylor, his elementary school principal, Dr. Patel, a local dentist who funded many of the center's programs, and Ms. Winters, a retired engineer who occasionally taught workshops. "This is Andrei," Mr. Washington introduced. "He's developed a curriculum for the engineering portion of our summer camp." Andrei handed out copies of his lesson plans with trembling hands. As the board members reviewed them, Mrs. Taylor looked up with surprise. "These are quite detailed, Andrei. You've even included modifications for different learning styles." "My cousin has dyslexia," Andrei explained. "I used to help him with homework. I learned what works for different kids." The questions began, about materials, time management, safety precautions. Andrei answered each one thoughtfully, his initial nervousness fading as he spoke about something he genuinely understood and cared about. Then came the question he'd been dreading. "Mr. Washington mentioned there was a legal issue we need to discuss," Dr. Patel said, his expression serious. "Something about community service hours?" Andrei took a deep breath. "Yes, sir. 3 months ago, I was with friends who shoplifted from a corner store. I didn't take anything, but I ran when they did. I was caught and went before Judge Wilson." The room fell silent. Andrei continued, determined to tell the whole truth. "The judge gave me 3 months probation and 20 hours of community service. I asked if I could fulfill those hours here, teaching at the camp, because that's what I'm good at and how I can best serve the community." Ms. Winters leaned forward. "And the judge agreed to this?" "Conditionally," Andrei replied. "He said it was up to you, the board. Why should we take a chance on you?" Mrs. Taylor asked directly. "There are plenty of volunteers with clean records." Andrei considered his answer carefully. "Because I made a mistake, but it doesn't define who I am or what I can contribute. And because working with these kids means everything to me." He reached into his folder and pulled out a letter. "Mr. Chen, the store owner, wrote this for you. I've been working for him after school, making amends." Ms. Winters took the letter and read it aloud. "The young man who works in my store is not the same one who ran away months ago. He shows up early, stays late, and treats my business with respect. He has earned my trust. I believe he will earn yours too." The board members exchanged glances. Mr. Washington smiled slightly. "We'll need to discuss this privately," Dr. Patel said. "Could you wait outside, Andrei?" Andrei paced the hallway outside the conference room, checking the clock every few minutes. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. With each passing moment, his hope dimmed. Surely if they were going to approve him, they wouldn't need to talk this long. He sat on a bench, staring at the floor tiles. A small child wandered over, clutching a paper airplane. Can you make it fly better? The boy asked, holding out the crumpled creation. Andrei smiled despite his nerves. Sure. He carefully unfolded the paper, smoothed out the creases, and demonstrated the proper folding technique. The secret is to make both sides exactly the same, he explained, showing the boy how to align the edges. Balance is everything in engineering. When they tested the rebuilt plane, it sailed across the hallway in a perfect arc. The boy's eyes widened with delight. That's so cool. Can you teach me more stuff like that? Before Andrei could answer, the conference room door opened. Mr. Washington stepped out and observed the scene, Andrei on his knees next to the child, surrounded by paper airplanes. The board is ready for you, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Andrei quickly gathered the paper planes and handed them to the boy. Practice those folds, he whispered before following Mr. Washington back inside. The board members' expressions gave nothing away as Andrei stood before them. We've reviewed your materials and discussed your situation thoroughly, Dr. Patel began. We've also called Judge Wilson for his input. Andrei's heart sank. They had called the judge? He spoke highly of you, Ms. Winters added, noting Andrei's surprise. Said you were one of the few young people who truly seem to understand the meaning of responsibility. Mrs. Taylor leaned forward. We've made our decision. You may fulfill your community service hours teaching at the engineering camp. Relief washed over Andrei, but Mrs. Taylor wasn't finished. However, there will be conditions. You'll be partnered with Ms. Winters at all times. You'll submit weekly progress reports. And you'll meet with Mr. Washington regularly to discuss any challenges. I understand, Andrei said, trying to contain his excitement. Thank you for trusting me. We're not just doing this for your benefit, Dr. Patel clarified. Those children out there, like the young boy you were just helping, they need good mentors. People who can teach them that mistakes don't have to define their future. As Andrei left the community center, he called his grandmother with the news. They said yes. His grandmother read it carefully. It's probably just to check on your progress. You've done everything he asked, haven't you? Yeah, but what if he doesn't think it's enough? She squeezed his shoulder. Then you'll deal with that too. One day at a time. The first day of engineering camp arrived bright and clear. 28 children between the ages of 8 and 12 filed into the community center, their faces a mix of excitement and nervousness. Andrei felt exactly the same way. Ms. Winters gave a brief introduction, then turned the floor over to Andrei. He had rehearsed his opening a dozen times, but facing the children directly, his carefully prepared words fled his mind. Instead, he picked up a simple paper clip. Who knows what this is? He asked. A paper clip, the children chorused. Right. But it's also an amazing piece of engineering, Andrei explained, bending the clip open. With one small change, it can become a tool, a hook, even part of a simple electric circuit. He demonstrated each transformation, watching as the children's eyes widened with interest. Engineering is about seeing possibilities, he continued, gaining confidence. About taking responsibility for the world around us and making it better. As the words left his mouth, Andrei realized how much they applied to his own life. 6 months ago, he had run from responsibility. Now he was embracing it, and in doing so, discovering parts of himself he never knew existed. From the back of the room, Mr. Washington gave him an encouraging nod. Beside him stood Deshawn, who had taken time off from his weekend job to help with the first day of camp. Today, Andrei told the children, we're going to build bridges strong enough to hold these textbooks. And we're going to do it with just these popsicle sticks, some string, and a lot of creativity. As the children broke into excited chatter, Andrei caught Ms. Winters smiling. For the first time since that day at the corner store, he felt not just responsible, but proud. The engineering camp was a resounding success. Over 2 weeks, Andre and Ms. Winters led the children through increasingly complex projects. Paper bridges gave way to simple electric circuits, which led to solar-powered toy cars designed by Deshawn. The children thrived under Andre's guidance, particularly those who struggled in traditional classroom settings. On the morning of his appointment with Judge Wilson, Andre dressed carefully in the same button-up shirt he'd worn to court months earlier. This time, however, the collar didn't feel so tight. His grandmother drove him to the courthouse, squeezing his hand before he went inside. "Remember who you are now," she said simply. The courthouse seemed different this time, less intimidating somehow. Andre checked in with the clerk and waited to be called, his mind reviewing everything he'd accomplished since that day in court. "The judge will see you now," the clerk finally announced. Judge Wilson sat at his desk rather than the bench, making the meeting feel less formal. He gestured for Andre to take a seat. "I've reviewed your plan," the judge began, tapping a folder on his desk. "And I've received reports from Mr. Chen and Mr. Washington. Ms. Winters also called my office yesterday." Andre sat up straighter, unsure where this was heading. "Everyone seems quite impressed with you," Judge Wilson continued. "Mr. Chen has offered you a permanent part-time position. Ms. Winters wants you to consider an engineering scholarship program she's connected with." "I didn't know that," Andre said, genuinely surprised. Judge Wilson nodded. "Success often comes from unexpected places." He leaned forward. "Do you remember what you said to me in court? The words that changed my mind about your case?" "I'm responsible," Andre replied without hesitation. "Yes." 2 simple words, but they demonstrated a level of maturity I rarely see in this courtroom. Judge Wilson opened a drawer and pulled out a document. "I've decided to terminate your probation early, given your exemplary behavior and the positive reports I've received." He pushed the paper across the desk for Andre to see. "This means your record will be sealed. Colleges won't see this incident when you apply." Andre stared at the document, its legal language blurring as his eyes welled with tears. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Don't thank me," Judge Wilson said, his voice gentler than Andre had ever heard it. "You earned this through your actions. Those 2 words you spoke meant nothing without the work you put in afterward to prove them true." As Andre left the courthouse, the summer sun warm on his face, he pulled out his phone and saw a text from Deshawn, "Kids asking when teacher Andre coming back. They want to build rockets next." Andre smiled. 6 months ago, a single mistake had threatened to define his future. Now, because he'd taken responsibility for that mistake, his future had never looked brighter. His grandmother was waiting in the car, questions in her eyes as he slid into the passenger seat. "It's over," he told her, showing her the document. "Judge Wilson terminated my probation." She pulled him into a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you." As they drove home, Andre thought about all the twists his life had taken since that day in the corner store. He thought about Mr. Chen, who had given him a chance to make amends. About Deshawn, who was finding his own path to responsibility. About the children at the camp, who looked at him not as someone who had made a mistake, but as someone with knowledge to share. 2 words had changed everything: "I'm responsible." Not just words he had spoken, but a truth he had lived.